Mom and Dad encouraged me a lot to go into this, certainly into preaching, and I still preach. But one of the questions that would often come up in local ministry, and still to an extent within even the university setting at Harding, but not as much as in local congregational work, is when people will ask me and make some comment about, well, you know, this book, the Bible, is so old and antiquated, times have changed, and therefore all of this is irrelevant to our world today. There's so much that's so radically different. Well, when I went into archaeology, one of the things that I was really interested in doing was trying to broaden my horizon of how better to understand what's going on in the biblical narrative. A lot of customs certainly are different. We're separated from those events by thousands of years, thousands of miles, and in a sense, thousands of culture differentials. But one of the serendipities that occurred that I was totally not anticipating was a demonstration that times, in a sense, have not changed. That actually, if we look at what people are wrestling with in antiquity, as well as the issues and topics with which they're wrestling now, are to a large extent about the same. Where's my next meal coming from? Is there life after death? How do I get along with my neighbors? How do I interact with my government? What is life really all about? What gives meaning to life and direction? These are questions that people have always wrestled with and continue to wrestle with. We've sort of obscured this, or a lot of people, and certainly the skeptical world has obscured this by recognizing that the Bible is an old document, but they've glossed over really what the Bible is addressing. We've changed the technical ways in which we do so many things. We can kill people today with laser beams from, miles and miles away, never even look anybody in the face. People today can commit fornication by looking at a video screen, whereas before they often would have to be, certainly in the presence of someone. We can steal today by electronic dealing, stealing somebody's identity and so forth in an electronic world. But when push comes to shove, those issues are really problems that come out of the heart of humanity. And God is attempting to try to change our hearts. And so as we go into this discussion, let me step down here. As we go into this discussion, the question often is asked, what does this, archaeology, have to do with that? Certainly, as I was making that transition into archaeology, one of the questions, again, people would often make, isn't it amazing how much the archaeology proves the Bible? Well, I have to honestly say that that's not why I'm into this. Now, there are certainly elements where archaeology has dovetailed very, very well with our understanding of Scripture. But there are some places where bringing these two disciplines together has been rather challenging. Not sure exactly what to do with it and how to bring these together. Now, I'm not at all suggesting the Bible is wrong. Roland de Vaux, a great archaeologist of a Roman Catholic faith a number of years ago, commented, and this is a paraphrase, he said, archaeology and the Bible should come together and intersect. But if they don't, either one, I'm not understanding archaeology correctly, or two, I'm not understanding the Bible correctly, or three, I'm not understanding either one of them correctly. And I think he's pretty well on target on that. And too many times, and when I say too many, it's certainly not a matter of it ought to change, but way too many times the Bible has been demonstrated to be true. My default setting, if you're into computers at all, my default setting is the Bible is true. And when I have trouble bringing this together, the Bible's true. If I have difficulty figuring out what do I do with this in relation to that, the Bible is true. I maybe have to adjust my understanding of what's going on in the Bible, but the Bible is true. But what I want to look at, I find far more meaningful, is how archaeology relates to the Bible and helping us better to understand what's going on in the biblical text. So we're going to look at a number of categories where archaeology has, in a sense, helped us better to appreciate. Maybe I should phrase this, it's helped me better to appreciate what's happening. And I'm going to give a number of examples from my childhood We tend to read and listen to things from our own world perspectives. I, again, am a preacher's kid, and I was raised within that context all my life, heard the Bible read all my life, read it all my life, and so forth. And there are inevitably those things that I would sort of read in a certain category. But I want us to consider, okay, I better turn this on, some customs in the biblical world. Now, some of these are a little bit different. One of the things that we would run into in the Bible, that I would run into, is do not remove the ancient landmarks. Now, this will give you some insight as to sort of my background. I was always interested in those historical marker signs. As you're driving down the road, historical marker ahead. I always wanted to stop and read those. I don't do it very often, but I always wanted to stop and read those and see what's happening. And when I would read about the ancient landmarks, I would think in terms of historical marker. I'm wrong. The Bible's right. I'm wrong. I'm misunderstanding what's going on. The ancient landmarks are these kinds of things. Obviously, as you look at this picture, the row of stones that you see in the middle of the field here are worthless from the standpoint of keeping any kind of animals separated one from another. They're not going to keep any kids out. It's only about this tall. But the purpose of this row of stones is to serve as that barrier between one person's field, say on the far left, and the field in the middle, and then someone else's perhaps field on the right-hand side. Here's another example, and obviously you can see that this is a little more fragmented, and God is anticipating the possibility that somebody might, under cover of darkness, say a new moon, come out here and move those stones over 6 inches to the right and increase one's own land holding to the theft of someone else's land rustling, I guess we would call this, rather than cattle rustling. What God is concerned about in these ancient landmarks is the respect of property rights. And if you read the larger context of all of these references to the ancient landmarks and so forth, part of what comes into play is God's concern about the well-being of the widows and the orphans, so that they don't lose their properties, so that they will be able to inherit and sustain themselves within that frame of reference. But as we look at this kind of thing, this also helps explain an episode in the pages of the Bible out of the book of Ruth, where Ruth comes back, of course, with Naomi, back to Bethlehem, and in chapter 2, they have certainly realized they need to go out they need to sustain themselves. And so Ruth says, let me go out and glean. And the text says she goes to that part of the field that belonged to Boaz. So that perhaps this part on the lower left would be Boaz's field, and that's Jaime Thudpucker's. Jaime Thudpucker is my imaginary friend, by the way. And so she goes to this part of the field rather than to the other part over there. And of course, as the story unfolds, we all know how it eventually ends. But people would live in the city and go out into the field to work. This is an almost exact opposite the way people today typically live as far as farming is concerned. Most farmers don't live in the city and go out into the field. They live out in the field, and then on the weekend maybe, I remember when I was a child back in East Tennessee, going into, Dad would be preaching and we would go into town and hear all the farmers from the neighborhood or there around the courthouse selling their vegetables and swapping the stories and all of that kind of thing. And that's not the way the ancient world tended to operate, because they would live within the town for protection in order to have the fellowship and the association and the encouragement of people of like mind. Another passage that I would sometimes misunderstand is the reference in the stories in Isaiah chapter 2 and the account in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is telling this parable, and Isaiah is telling a parable about a man who buys a field and builds a watchtower in it. Here's a picture of a wonderfully well-preserved watchtower in one of the fields there in Israel. When I would read that passage, I always thought of the fire towers in East Tennessee. You know, they would stand out there in the forest. I always wanted to go climb one of those things. Mom and Dad wouldn't let me do that. But I always wanted to climb one of those. So when I would read this parable about the watchtower, I would think in terms of that fire tower. Well, clearly they might have used this for a fire tower, but that really wasn't their primary concern. The watchtower was to protect the crops against theft at time of harvest. And so they would post somebody in one of these to sort of watch out over the field and make sure that nobody's going to come in and steal the crops. Our son-in-law raises alfalfa out in Southern California. It's interesting to watch him as the harvest starts to come in. He goes paranoid about fearing that somebody's going to go steal hay bales. And in the county fair, they even have a hay bale stealing contest. Ironically, he tends to win that. I'm not sure what to make of that, but anyway. But again, it's sort of the commentary on humanity. You know, you've had this kind of concern for all these years, and to a large extent, we're still worrying with similar kinds of dishonesty in our world. To a large extent, things have not changed particularly much. You're looking here in the center of the slide. Standing on its end is a threshing sledge. It's leaning up against the wall, and they're shaped like this, so that the front end, the top in this case, is curved upward. And this allows the grain then to slide fairly easily underneath this. And you see all these holes that are inside this, these black spots. These are holes that were drilled in this, and then pieces of flint jammed into the holes to serve as the teeth. That when this is dragged around the grain, it breaks the grain away from the chaff or from the stalk. And so you drag this around and you break all this apart. And of course, none of us really want to eat this mess of material. Amos will even indict people who will sell the chaff along with the grain as sort of an artificial inflation and dishonesty. But clearly, most of us, we're eating our bowl of cereal in the morning and we see a stalk of grass floating around it. We freak out. At least I've seen a lot of folks do that. I've just learned to eat it, thinking in terms of that. But please don't add any extra. All right. But in this process, they're going to winnow this, and here's the winnowing process. They take a fork or a shovel, shove it into this, throw it up in the air, the wind blows the chaff away, which is lighter, the grain falls back to the ground, and they do this over and over and over and over and over again until they get to a point where they don't see any more dust blowing away. And then they're going to gather that up into bags or vessels of some kind and take it away and store it. It's a setting similar to this that John refers to when he talks about the Lord has his winnowing fork in his hand, and he's going to gather the grain into his barn, and the chaff will be burned with unquenchable fire. There's some interesting implications in that unquenchable fire component, but I don't have time to go into it. Now, in this situation, they have gathered the grain now on the threshing floor. And again, we come back to the account of Ruth, where Ruth is going to slip out there into the threshing area. Naomi has encouraged her to go out, put on your best and clean yourself up and go out there and sneak out onto the threshing floor and open these negotiations with Boaz. Boaz, however, is there to protect his crops. So I picture him on the edge of this pile of grain, sort of nestling down in his Select Comfort grain mattress, getting everything adjusted just right, falling off to sleep. Ruth comes up, and she then is going to initiate the negotiations, and Boaz, of course, is startled in all of this, and eventually the wedding is going to unfold. But it'd be a scene similar to this where that would have unfolded. And as we think in terms of the dynamics of this, we can gain a better appreciation. Certainly the book of Ruth explains a good bit of this, but to envision this, I think, can often help us. As I was leaving Gibeon, where that example was taken, I looked down the slope and I saw this building that had this stuff drying on the roof. And I immediately, of course, thought of Rahab. Where she takes the spies and she hides them underneath the flax that is on the roof. And I looked at this and I thought, man, that is a classic example. But then I got to looking at it. There's another element. Notice the little low wall that's around the perimeter of that. Interesting, in Deuteronomy 22, God has a law in which he says, when you build a house, put a low wall around the perimeter of the roof so that nobody will fall off. Now that's a liability factor. That's a building code. I don't know if they had building inspectors, but it's a building code where God is concerned about the safety and well-being of the individuals. Now, the roofs were actually used for all kinds of things. Again, when I was a youngster, I used to think always in terms of a pitched roof. Like this, and Mom and Dad, don't you get on the roof, Dale, don't you get on the roof, don't you get on the roof. And, of course I did a few times. And, of course, they knew occasionally when I would. But they were concerned about my safety and well-being, falling off the roof. Of course, there's the potential damage to the shingles and all of that kind of thing. But the roofs in this part of the world are often used as sort of patios, as extensions of the family. There's an occasion where Elisha has some friends who are going to build a room on the roof, and he is going to have that as sort of his apartment as he travels through. You have Saul sleeping on the roof when he goes to meet Samuel, and Samuel then is going to anoint him the next morning after he comes down from the cool of the evening. On the other hand, you have this episode, and please don't think in terms of David as a peeping David, but David is described as being on the roof from which he sees Bathsheba taking a bath, and of course things unfold there. But he's not up there like the old VeggieTales thing looking for somebody necessarily. I don't think he is at all. I think it's one of those accidental scenes, and he just lets it get out of hand. But nonetheless, he's on the roof legitimately. It's sort of a siesta kind of episode where after his rest he goes out onto the roof and he's looking around down the slope of the hill there in Jerusalem, and it would be quite easy under some circumstances to see things that you should see. Peter in the book of Acts goes up on the roof to pray. Certainly a context of relative quiet. But again, it's not because the roof is an extraordinary location, but it's because it is part of the structure. If you go in through the Bible and look at all the places where roofs appear, it's amazing. It's amazing what unfolds here. Even some lessons that are applied to the stuff from the roof. But that's a lesson I'll put into your court. Then there's technology in the ancient world. Technology is really rather impressive as we look at this. We're looking at a plan of the city of Gibeon. Gibeon is a wonderful example of quite a number of things. It's not really gotten corrupted with modernization. The wall that goes across the diagonal from the lower right to the upper left is part of the old city wall that had been excavated. The outside, of course, is labeled. The inside of the city is down on the lower left. The outside is the upper right. The problem, though, is when you have a city that's built on a hill, most of the time the water resource is at the bottom of the hill. At this point, a student in class will say, I know of one. And I didn't say all of them. Listen, most of the time the water source, the spring, is at the foot of the hill. And of course this creates some problems. In time of siege, in times of difficulty, the vulnerability of the water source becomes a problem. As people would go out to get their water, they are liable to be picked off very easily. And so a lot of these towns try to figure out how do we access the water supply in times of crisis in a safe circumstance. Well, the folks at Gibeon have two strategies. I'm going to describe the second strategy they had first, because it in and of itself is rather interesting. The spring is outside the city at the end of this grade line that you have here. It looks sort of like a snake. And they dig a tunnel from inside the wall that goes under the wall, and this is the entrance on the lower left into the tunnel. If you can get to Gibeon and go there, you can still go through this. It's really fascinating. The Bible doesn't say anything about this, but it certainly is something that dates from the time of the biblical period. It dates from around the 8th or 9th century BC. And then you go down this, and there's a flight of steps that are carved into the tunnel as you go down. They're well worn, very well worn, as thousands and thousands of feet have gone through all of this and worn this smooth. And inevitably somebody gets their jar full of water, they're on their way back up, they drop the jar, it breaks, the water flows back down, and then you have the slime that begins to grow and everything else, and the hazard that intrinsically is there. And then when you finally get to the bottom, though, here's the water source. It's inside a cave at this point, which they can close on the other end in order to block it from any enemy that might be coming. This is the second of the water systems that was at Gibeon. The first one is quite fascinating on a number of levels. It's referred to as the Pool of Gibeon. It's referred to in 2 Samuel chapter 2 and also in Jeremiah, I think chapter 41. Jeremiah is only a geographic reference point, but in 2 Samuel chapter 2, there's this episode after Saul has died. The armies of David and the remnant army of Saul come together, and Joab and company are going to be battling this out. 12 soldiers from Saul's side, 12 soldiers from David's side, and they come together and they fight at the Pool of Gibeon. And it's explicit that it's the Pool of Gibeon. Now, why does it refer to the Pool of Gibeon? Gibeon as a town itself is only about 7 acres in area. Most of these towns are really quite small. So to refer to the Pool of Gibeon, rather than simply say Gibeon, has to be talking about a specific location within the confines of the town. Almost certainly this is it. The elevation, you see down at the bottom, you see the blue, it represents the water table. And they've dug this shaft from the surface all the way down, but they stop at some point here, and they continue a tunnel through this, finally reaching the water table. This is about 80-foot elevation drop, dug through solid stone Limestone, something I don't really want to do by hand. They didn't have explosives and all this kind of stuff. So they're chipping away and all this kind of thing. So a lot of work involved here. Of course, they didn't know the advantages that we have of explosives, so they didn't really think in terms of that. But I'd hate to have been a worker here. But in the process, they dig down, they eventually reach the water table. This is a view of the actual site. It's very difficult to get an entire picture unless you have an elevated shot. I did not have a drone with me in order to take a picture here. So I did the best I can with my wide-angle lens. You can see the flight of steps that's going down, and that, by the way, represents about what is over here on the right-hand side. But you come down to a certain level, you might see in the drawing this platform right there with a drawing of some individuals on it. There I am actually standing on that platform. And I'm inclined to think that's the arena where the 24 soldiers battled it out. Now, that's an opinion. The text doesn't say that. But otherwise, why the Pool of Gibeon reference? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's a tantalizing point. This is the older water system, the one that was less efficient than the one that they used that I showed earlier to replace it. But again, some of the technology. Here are some ivory pieces from the palace of Ahab, from the ivory house, the house of ivory that the Bible will talk about in Kings, as well as a reference in the book of Amos, the indictment of the luxury of the people. But these are some of the ivory pieces. Now, please realize these were not carved with little Dremel tools and all that kind of thing that our craftsmen today will use. These are all hand-carved out of ivory and everything else. And all of this is imported from Phoenicia, which is not particularly surprised in view of the fact that Ahab's wife is Phoenician. And so I can picture, I've been married off into this horrible land of Israel, and I want some remnants of home. So I want some furniture from Phoenicia. So let's get some ivory stuff in here so I can feel more comfortable. She's a real dog in this situation. Sorry. But as you look at this, I mean, this is some fine craftsmanship, some exquisite work. These are only about this tall. They're really quite small, miniature kinds of things. And these would typically be the inlays in the back of the chair or underneath the arms of the chair or perhaps in the headboard and so forth, maybe in the rails embedded into the rails of the bed and all that kind of thing. But there's something rather interesting here. Notice on the left-hand side, there's a little tab at the top. And then there's a bottom, you can see a little tab at the bottom. Sometimes these would be found with letters on them. The equivalent of A and B. Now, those of you might be ahead of me here. You go to Walmart and you buy your box of furniture that all you need is a wrench and a screwdriver and put it together, and then you got to figure out those instructions. Put tab A into slot A, put tab B into slot B, and so forth and so on. Pretty tantalizing kind of thing. Now, we don't know how all these pieces of furniture were shipped. Were they shipped pre-assembled, or were they shipped unassembled and put together at site? We're at a loss here. But certainly it tends to imply, obviously, some trade connections over fairly large regions, as well as some craftsmanship in a sense that you and I can appreciate. Now, these pieces are really particularly surprising. Look at the one on the right-hand side. This very beautiful scepter. It looks like gold, but it's not gold. And when they were first discovered, both of them are about the same color, by the way. The one on the left is a black and white photograph. And both of them have this copper look. And when they were discovered, the archaeologists thought they were bronze, and they even thought that these items were from the temple and the destruction before the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. They thought they were squirreled away in anticipation of coming back and retrieving them. But then as they looked at the larger context of everything else associated with this, they came to the realization these have nothing to do with the 1st century A.D. or the 1st century B.C. or the 2nd B.C. or the 3rd B.C. These go back all the way to 3500 B.C. Now, they thought they were bronze because of the coloration and the hardness of the material. But it turns out it's not bronze. Bronze was not a product that came onto the scene until about 2000 B.C. Turns out these are tempered with arsenic. 2 to 12% arsenic in order to make this color, in order to make it more easy to cast. In addition to the fact, the items that are attached on top of that are welded to the edge. Not soldered. Soldered is using a metal to serve as a binder. Welding is the meshing of the two pieces into one. through a heat source, a focused heat source. I mean, this is impressive stuff. 3,500 BC. You and I would sit here, how do you make copper in the first place? And how would you get it anywhere to this level? What would make you think of putting anything like arsenic in here to make it easier to cast and so forth? The sophistication of this technology is bewildering. In this case, you're looking at some sewer pipes associated from the time of the patriarchs. Most of us don't think of sewer pipes at the time of the patriarchs. Sewer pipes, a lot of places of the world, even in the United States, were not something that came into existence until just a few decades ago. Remember the outhouse? All right, so most of it, those of us who are older remember outhouses. And so this whole concept. But at the same time, look at this. I realize in about 1960s, I'm not sure the exact date of this, they came up with these new sewer pipes that were made out of that asphalty stuff. And then eventually they got away from that. But before that, they were ceramic with a flared end, and you would put the straight end into the flare end, seal it with clay, and you'd have these links that you would tie up, and that would be your sewer line. Now we tend to use plastic of some kind. Again, the same kind of flared end and a straight end. In this case, these are about this long. They're about this big around. And you have a tapered end that goes into the straight end, and you would seal it with the clay from the time of the patriarchs. This is pretty sophisticated stuff. We tend to think in terms of our own intellectual arrogance. We don't know how they built the pyramids. Therefore, and this is, I hope I'm not treading on anybody here. We don't know how they built the pyramids. Therefore, humans didn't build it. They were built by space aliens. This is a form of intellectual arrogance. To think that because we can't figure out what they did, therefore it wasn't human that did it. But in reality, the people of antiquity were far more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. At Tel Bet Shemesh, where I excavate, we discovered most everything we find is by accident. We never know what we're going to run into. It's one of the thrills of archaeology. And we found a number of years ago the cistern. And here's a cruciform, here's a cutaway view of that cistern. This is the stairway going down into it, which is reflected on the right-hand side of the photograph here. There's no significance to the cruciform shape. Don't infer anything associated with, symbolism or anything like that. This is just engineering kind of issues that come into play, at least as far as we know. But apart from the sophistication of digging this out of solid rock, one of the things that was really dumbfounding was they sealed this with plaster. And here's a picture of the plaster that still clings to the wall. The cistern went out of use in about 635 BC and was sealed until about 1992 AD. So almost 2,700 years, this thing was hidden from public view altogether. We didn't know it existed. And when we excavate it, there's still plaster on the walls. Now, if you know anything about house construction or building construction, we have trouble getting past plaster to stay on a wall for 50 years. How did they manage to make this plaster that still sticks on the wall for 2,700 years in a damp environment? That's pretty impressive stuff as far as I'm concerned. Or here's one. This will freak you out. I've got to step down here. I notice this gets really loud to me anyway. This is a surgical procedure called trephination, and somebody has a headache, so they go to the doctor and they say, please help me out here. And so the doctor decides, okay, you need to have a hole cut in your head. Whoops. Okay. If you look at this, you have the squared hole and the saw marks where they've cut the flap of skin, they folded the flap of skin down, and they've... I like the sound effects. All right. And the other direction, they remove the part of the skull, and then you're supposed to get better. Well, we actually know that a lot of folks in antiquity did. This person didn't. And we know that by the freshness of the saw marks. But a number of these trephination skulls have been found where the hole has totally closed back. So we know they survived it, the bone grew back, and everything else. Now, one of the real lurking questions is, what are you going to give me to put me under here? Because I don't want to be awake through this. None of us would want to be awake through this. Which moves us from a technological kind of perspective to issues of ancient trade. In ancient trade, there's a vessel that we often find, and I have here one of these. This is known as a bilbil. Now, we call it bilbil. We don't know what they called it in antiquity. But this little vessel has a fairly small opening, and it would be filled with sort of a olive oil consistency kind of stuff. The reason we call it bilbil, you're going to love this. This is not made up, by the way. You pour it out, and it goes bil, 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 bil. We're not the brightest folks in the world, all right? Bil, bil, bil. But we call them bilbil. Now, several years ago, there was an archaeologist, a member of the State Department from another country, and he said, look at the white lines on this. And you can see some of the applique clay on this and the white lines on the one on the left. This one has the white lines that you can still see. This dates, by the way, from about 1350 BC. All right. And he says, you know, if you turn that upside down, it looks like an opium poppy bulb. The blossoms are gone, and they would slice the bulb of this in order to extract the opium pop. This may explain volumes about politics, by the way. Anyway, so he comes up with this theory, and so eventually a number of tests were run on this. Here's the opium poppy that he has under consideration. And some of these have actually yielded evidence of residue of opiate derivative inside it. Now, I tell you one thing, if I was going to do a trephination, give me a jug of this. Oh, maybe not a jug, but anyway, help me get through this thing. And the special shape of it perhaps is a marketing strategy. Maybe you don't know the name of the stuff. You say, I mean, all the kids driving down the highway know what 2 gold arches represent. They may not be able to read a lick of English, but they know what those stand for. This was probably a marketing strategy. Give me a jug of that little bottle there. And so people would be taking advantage of that. Again, I'm going to set this here. Please feel free to come up and look at this stuff. Don't touch anything. Only one item is a replica, and it's that one on that end. So anyway, beyond that. This is an oxide copper ingot. Now, most of us come to the realization that not everywhere in the world has everything that we need. Now, we don't think about this too much because of the rapid transit and rapid transportation and familiarity with all of the goods that are around the world. But obviously, when we look on the back of it and it says Heco in Mexico, or it says made in India or Vietnam or China or Japan or whatever, we are conscious of the connections that are made globally. Well, the people in the ancient world had similar realities. Not everywhere had copper, not everywhere had gold, not everywhere had diamonds, not everywhere had XYZ. And so they would learn where all of these other places are. Now, as they learn where they are, they're going to make connections. Now, what happens in these connections eventually often can become a deterioration of identity. As the ethnic definition morphs and people become more sensitive to other countries and so forth. And I'm not saying this is intrinsically wrong, but there are times when certainly the Lord says, I want you to be my people. And He's trying to get Israel to maintain an identity with Him. But as they begin interacting in significant ways with other cultures, they begin to absorb the religious convictions of those other people. And this is part of what the problem eventually becomes. In this situation, you have a copperhide ingot, an oxhide ingot, in the shape of this stretched oxhide. And this weighs about 65 pounds. This is a talent of copper. This is what the Bible's talking about when it talks about a talent of something. It is about 65 pounds. It'll vary a little bit depending on the standard that you're looking at, but that's the approximate range. I used to live in Arizona, as indicated in the earlier comments, and when I showed this at the congregation where I was preaching at the time, suddenly I lived in a copper mining town with copper smelting and everything else, and everybody suddenly perked up and said, that's almost exactly the same way we do it now. And this was designed to be put into racks in ships and shipped off long distance. In Arizona, they would put it on rail cars and ship it out and transport it, the raw good. Now, at Tel Mikne, the Philistine side of Ekron, where I first began my excavation experience in 1985, several of the items we found were olive press installations. And here is an olive press, and the olives would be put in the middle part here, and they would be crushed into a pulpy mass. They would gather that up and put that pulpy mass into sort of burlap bags and stack them up on the presses on each side. Now here is a reconstruction of one of these. The press is over here, the crushing basin is there, the press is here, with a wall back here, a beam coming out, and the stones that would serve as the counterweights. And the olive oil would be mashed out of the burlap bags into this vessel. It would then be lifted out with hot water and put into the storage vessels from which then it would be distributed. We found over 100 of these olive press installations at Tel Mikne, Ekron, Philistine side of Ekron. And the estimated capacity of production is 1.1 million quarts of oil a year. That's a lot of olive oil. Now, you have to also realize this is done within a 2-month span. So there's a really intense effort to produce this. In addition to the fact, the jars that we have with neutron activation and some of the scientific nuclear kind of studies, we have discovered some of these jars as far away as southern Spain. So you're looking at 2,500 miles away. Trade connections, as people become aware of what other people have. Not really significantly different from our world today. Now, I show this picture because this is sort of a New Testament domestic version of an olive press. In this situation, you have the platform over here on the left-hand side with olives placed on the basin and this large stone rolled around that, mashing the olives into the pulpy mass. The olive oil would flow over to the edge and then down these spouts into the jars. This one is in the museum below the Damascus Gate now. And it's not quite as efficient as that one, but still a pretty good size stone there. The reason I show this one is because this is what Jesus is talking about when he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones that believes on me to stumble, it would be better for him that a great millstone be hung around his neck and he be cast into the depth of the sea. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of weight to keep a body underwater. Most of us know that. But when he talks about something of this magnitude, he is making a point of significance. Now, you and I need to sit up and take notice of the impression that we leave on other people and how we live. Let our light shine, not the light of the devil shine. Let's let the Lord's light shine. And if we don't let that shine the way it ought to be, this is the kind of condemnation that Jesus has in mind. Very sobering. Then there's government. Seems like we can't escape government. Several excavations have found these ceramic pots like this. This one actually has the word Hamash on it, which means fifth. Has nothing to do with Southern comfort. It's a fifth having to do with a 20% tax rate here. And the silver is collected, and here is one of these jars with the silver splayed out on the bottom. And this was being collected and taken into the government. Now, this would be separate and apart from? Okay, this is apart from the regular tithing. This would be the government's rake. 20% plus then the other. Things haven't changed a whole lot in our world. Then there's religion. I show you this picture. Archaeology rarely has anything to say about doctrine. Okay. But this time it does. This is a 6th century AD baptistry at a place called Horvat Shivta. Here's another view of it. I think you can readily tell this is a baptistry designed for immersion. Now, what is interesting here, this is in an area where the average rainfall is about 2 inches of rain a year. I trust you're aware of the fact that's not going to really be very helpful as far as agriculture is concerned. So they gather the water up in cisterns and so forth. But for them to use a baptistry, an immersion baptistry, as their strategy for baptism, rather than sprinkling or pouring, I think says volumes. If sprinkling and pouring were legitimate strategies by which to do baptism, why would they, don't take this as a disrespect, why would they waste water to immerse with such limited water resources? This is a pretty telling kind of point. This is one of those things that archaeology can help us with. Quickly, most of you are familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is one of the jars. This is in a museum. And here's one of the manuscripts. This is the commentary on Habakkuk. Most of you, I expect, cannot read this, which is fine, but there is something I want to point out to you. As you scroll through this, pardon the pun there, As you scan through this, you'll run into a couple of sections where the letters are shaped a little differently from the others. There's a cluster of them right there. You see those? They look a little different than everything else. Can you tell that? Nobody's saying anything. How about down here? This cluster is a little more dramatically different. When you run into this, these are the name of God. Now, they didn't do this in all the manuscripts, but what happens here is when they ran into the name of the Lord, the Tetragrammaton, rather than write it in the same style of script that characterized the rest of the manuscript, they would write it in an archaic form. It would be somewhat akin to you and me as we're copying a text and we run into the name of the Lord, we write it in Old English letters. And this is a manifestation of their reverence for God. Brother Parker, I think, mentioned earlier, taking the name of the Lord in vain. This is part of what they're avoiding. They're showing their reverence for the name of God. Certainly something that we need to sit up and take notice of. And that brings me to the end of our discussion, and I think the end of our time. Thank you very much.